есть город, который я вижу во сне. О, если бы знали, как дорог у Черного моря открывшийся мне в цветущих акациях город, в цветущих акациях город у Черного моря.
Thank you very much, Carol. Where is Carol? For inviting me here to this extraordinary conference. And what a city to have it in. Thank you, Carol, for bringing all these amazing people here together. And in a city which actually was the crucible of the 1905 revolution, when workers rose up and when the mutiny started on the battleship Potemkin. I'm going to talk quite informally in my half hour, because I'm really thinking about the very interesting papers that we had yesterday. I'm thinking particularly about Lawrence Ritter's amazing film in that interview with that woman who remembered what had happened during the Armenian genocide. It's terribly important, isn't it? And time is running out, but it's terribly important that we intensify our search to find those hidden voices, the voices that are often never heard, of women and girls who suffered from revolution, from armed conflict and sectarian violence. I'm going to talk particularly about widows and wives of the missing, because these women's voices are very rarely heard, and it is quite extraordinary and even scandalous that in all the documents that come out of the United Nations, the agreed conclusions of 20 years from the UN Commission on the Status of Women, even in the 1325 and the subsequent 7 resolutions from the UN Security Council, you never see the word widow. They're never heard, their voices are not heard. And yet these conflicts and wars continuing today create not just millions of widows, but millions of half-widows, the women whose lives are in limbo because they don't know the fate of their husbands who've been forcibly disappeared, who are missing. Are they dead? Are they in some mass grave? Are they in prison? Where are they? And what is their legal status of these women? I think that now it's beginning to change. There are more and more women historians who are looking painstakingly, trying to recover and research and publicize the voices of these women. I've just been reading. I knew very, very little really about what happened to women during the Russian Revolution. So in the last 2 weeks, every minute, I've been reading wherever I can, trying to find out. And I was just reading the amazing, painstaking description of life in the Soviet Union, particularly under the terror, by Nadezhda Mandelstam, who was the widow of Osip Mandelstam, the poet who died in the labor camps. And he died from starvation in 1938. But she was saying in that book how widowhood was almost inevitable from the moment that her husband was arrested during those terror years that followed the revolution. And she talked about how the widows queued for hours at the gates of prisons and camps, trying to send food or clothes or money, or just to get a message or to be given a piece of paper about where they were. And eventually, years afterwards sometimes, they would get a note, a piece of paper saying, died of heart attack. And food parcels were returned because the addressees was dead. But actually people then who were sought to the labour camps, they were thought of as dead. No other country suffered more from the war then than the Soviet Union. I think something like 26 million Soviet citizens lost their lives, 2/3 of them civilians, and 4 million disappeared between 1941 and 1945. And the demographic consequences of the war were catastrophic. 3/4 of the killed were young men between the ages of 18 and 45. And so the kolkhoz became a place for widows, children, and old men. And Soviet agriculture never really recovered from that from that terrible, terrible demographic loss. Nobody really knows the human cost of the Russian Revolution, but because there were so many people also who died from famine and disease. Nobody even wanted to have children in those terrible years, so that also many widows suffered because they had no children who might look after them in their old age. And the highest death rates, of course, were among the adult men. And in Petrograd alone, there were 65,000 widows in 1920, but death was so common it touched everyone. And children were so malnourished that they died young or stunted. I'm talking about what happened in the Russian Revolution, but I'm also skipping over maybe the Arab Spring, but I'm going to compare the widowhood in what we can find out in the Russian Revolution to another miracle revolution that's going on right now that Carol knows exactly what I'm going to talk about. I wonder if you can guess. A miracle revolution that is going on right now in what we used to call Rojava. Hands up if anybody has heard of Rojava. Well done, well done, well done. And now it's called the North Syrian Democratic Confederation. And that is an extraordinary miracle revolution that is going on, that we all have to do everything we can to safeguard. And why is it a miracle? And why is it different? Why is it special? It's because gender equality is absolutely central to it. So I'll talk about that after I've talked a bit more. Oh, we're going to talk about it anyway in the afternoon, but still. So I'm thinking about when I've been reading a lot of books by somebody called Orlando Figes, Figes, Orlando Figes. And again, I was talking to Lawrence Rutter yesterday about that book because it's called The Whisperers. It's the most amazing book which he wrote at the end of the 90s, when he was still able to talk to people of the age that I am now, who in the 90s were still alive, who are the children of the mothers, the widows who lived through the terror and who had their spoilt biographies, who could never say who they really were, because all through that time under the Soviet Union, to have been one of those people among the kulaks, the people who'd been sent to the labor camps, to be any of those people was absolutely just to ruin your life. So people went on all through their lives not really saying who they were, not being able to talk about who they were. And in The Whisperers, he picks all this up. And of course, many of the women that he's talking about are the widows. It's interesting because I think now there'll be more and more efforts to find diaries, to find letters, to find the experience of these women. Because when we, in the last, yesterday and generally, we're always talking about women and women in conflict and women in peace building. And we're talking about women all the time, and that comes from the top because that's how governments see women and the UN sees women. We talk about women as if they're an homogenous group, when in fact we're not. We're extremely diverse. Even here we are diverse, not only by ages, but by religion, by ethnicity, and whether we're rural, we're urban, we're literate, we're illiterate. And there are particular subsects of women who actually suffer in silence, unrecorded, unreported, huge abuses, discrimination and ill treatment. And their condition and the way they are treated requires particular specific policies that would address and satisfy, address their basic needs and recognize their roles. And among these subsects of women, they are the widows. And every day now, every day as these conflicts go on, the numbers of widows of all ages, not just the elderly, dispel the myth that widows are all elderly. They could be child widows in countries where you have underage marriage, young mothers, they are of all ages. And the great thing about this subsect of widows is that they're never counted. We don't know how many they are. And you know how important data is to actually influence governments to take action, because ultimately it's governments that have to address the conditions of women in their own country and ensure that women are part of the peace processes, that they're part of decision making and their voices are heard. But you're not finding widows at the peace tables, and we're not finding widows in decision making in many countries. And this is why the incredible miracle of Rojava is something which is not just a model for the Kurds in Syria, it's a model for the whole of Syria, and actually it's a model for all countries across the world, because you can't have peace, and you can't have democracy, and you can't have justice, you can't have the end of conflict, unless you have a really free society where women are treated with dignity, where women are, in that sense, equal to men, not to be like men, but to be actually equal in decision-making, in influence of the policy. I just think, I kept trying to read through all these books by Orlando and other people about the revolution, and I could never find particularly what was going on about the widows. But what we do know is that in 1918, after the revolution, then there were incredible a new family law, which was supposed to free women from, allow them to divorce their husbands, have abortion. It was all, a whole lot of, a series of legislation for women, but that was very much for the educated women who lived in the cities, who were educated, who were middle class or upper class, and it didn't really look at what was happening to the rural women, the peasant women in the countryside. And they actually, again, you have to pick it up and read through the books and try and extract what was happening to the widows in the countryside, which was absolutely terrible, because as in so many societies, widows are denied their real rights. When their husbands die, they're often denied their rights to inheritance, their rights to land. And that goes on today, even though countries legislate about inheritance and rights to land, widows often don't have any rights to land. And even if they did have land, they would be unable to actually cultivate it. What was happening in the rural areas after the revolution in Russia was that the widows could not cultivate the land, even if they were able to get it. They couldn't actually afford to find the labor. The laborers exploited the people who were prepared to cultivate for them, exploited them, charged them huge prices, and many of them had to either give up and go into the cities and be exploited there in finding work in the cities. And at the same time, as you know, when the Great Famine and the collectivization, there was a huge migration from the cities because the food was so scarce that then people from the urban centres went to the rural areas to try and find land, and that further affected the rights of these women who were widows, because they were actually fighting men to try and get the land. I thought, and then I was thinking about trying to find some really interesting widows, and I thought, gosh, this is really interesting, because Lenin's widow, Natasha Krupskaya, And she was an amazing woman, and she was Minister of Education. She did all sorts of extraordinary things. But by 1931, I think it was, I'm sure my dates are all wrong, 1931, Stalin thought, oh God, what's happening? All these women are getting divorced, they're all having abortions, nobody's having children, we've got to do something about this, women have got to have children. And he started to pull everything back on restricting the right to abortion and divorce and everything. And I love this story, because we've got to laugh at this conference sometimes. So this is a wonderful story that Lenin's widow had this terrible row with Stalin, and he was very angry with her, and he said, do you know, if you go on behaving like this, I'm going to appoint another woman to be Lenin's widow. So I thought that was really extraordinary. So there were all these, and then I was thinking about when Carol gave me, I wanted to come to this conference, I didn't know what to talk about. Carol gave me the title, Invisible Widow Victims of the Revolution. And then I really didn't quite know how I was going to deal with it. And then I began to look and try and find where there were, who were, but people often didn't tell you who were widows. I mean, there were amazing things that happened. The women's battalion, what was it, that incredible women's battalion for death, which was fighting immediately after the revolution. And then I think that actually the February to February 1917, which was the real, before that, I mean, that was the women's revolution. It was the women who were actually started it all. So again, you see how the women were all part of this, and then how hard it was for them afterwards to get back into real decision making, because the real issues for women were never really properly, they were never they never actually really changed the structures. They still were male structures all the way through. Yes, I think the first women's battalion of death, that was 6,000 Russian women served in those battalions. And surely among them, there must have been some of them who were widowed, fighting both in the European War and in the Civil War and in the Revolution. But again, we just don't know how much it was. And there were all sorts of extraordinary things that I read about, how widows found it very difficult, even in that time of the terror and the time of the famine, even to bury their husbands, because it was so hard for the funeral services, because they'd been nationalized, and the burial took endless paperwork, and many of them were illiterate anyway. They couldn't deal with that. That even the timber to make the coffins was scarce. So poor widows wrapped their dead in mats or in borrowed coffins with the phrase, "Please return," and with a label on the outside. And there was a shortage of graves, and actually corpses just, decomposed, in the morgues. I've only got 10 minutes left, so back to Rojava. Yes, this is extraordinary. In northeast Syria, the Syrian Kurds, in a region which is actually so well known for the low status of women, and for religious extremism, for absolute intolerance. In just there, they have developed this extraordinary new form of society. And it's the ideology which is really interesting. It comes from their imprisoned leader, Abdullah Öcalan. I don't know that there's any other male leader in history that actually realize that if you don't have gender equality, you don't have democracy, you don't have justice, you don't have freedom. But it comes from Abdullah Öcalan, the idea that this is central. So in Rojava, it wasn't just a little fringe thing. It's absolutely central to the way everything happens. And it's about communalism. It's about people's committees. It's about all the decision-making that comes from the top to the bottom. And every single institution, every single organization, whether it's a company, a bank, a parliament, the People's Defense Units, an education faculty or university, every single organization, association must have co-chairs, a man and a woman, So that's an extraordinary, extraordinary thing. And it's amazing because it's not just now in Rojava, where Carol and I went with some difficulty on our last trip, practically had to swim the Tigris to get there. It's now half the population are IDPs, internally dispersed people who come from all the other regions of Syria. They've come from Aleppo, they've come from Raqqa. So they are Arabs, they are Assyrians, they're Copts, they're Christians, they're Druze, they're Levi, they're all these other people who are all part of this as well. So that even now the Yazidi women and the Arab women are also organized themselves into women's committees and so on. Look, I'm not going to have time to tell you all about Rojava, but I'm just going to show you, I'm sure I had it in my web, here it is. Everyone, you can get it on Amazon. It's a great book, Revolution in Rojava. It's a really good book. I'm sure it's been translated by now. And it's edited by Janet Beale. And it really explains, but it's written 2 years ago, so things have gone on since then. And of course now the border is closed and it's all pretty bad because there's no humanitarian aid going in. But what I really want to say is that in all the peace accords, and we'll be talking about this later, and I think I'm talking again about the CEDAW, it's all very well to say we want women on these peace tables, we want women in decision making, but actually what women? What women? And there's a danger here in many countries that you choose your national women's organization and you plonk them in there, and they maybe are almost in league with the government, or they're not really representing all the women. They don't even know about all these other women. And we're saying that in every country, and in most countries, there's a problem, in every country where widows suffer extreme discrimination, stigma, poverty, whatever the law says, in many countries, widows have a very, very bad time. They're either forcibly married, forcibly taken by a husband's brother, or not allowed to remarry, but mainly they are in poverty. They are the sole carers, not just of their children, but of wounded, of elderly people, other people who are dependent upon them. So they have huge roles, not just as carers, but they're maybe farmers, workers, market women. And it's there, and they have suffered terribly because of the conflicts. So it's absolutely vital that they are there at these so-called peace accords in terms of 1325. And I ask in my own country, the United Kingdom, where I sit on a committee to advise my government about our revision of our National Action Plan on 1325, for goodness sake, encourage countries to have as their indicators and targets in their plan, have they counted their widows? How many widows have they got? What widows are suffering? What social supports are they using? What are their survival and coping strategies? Are widows in begging? Are widows in prostitution? Are widows selling their daughters into early marriage? And you know that in many countries, widowhood, well, it's a root cause of poverty across the generations, but it's also a driver of underage marriage. And nobody's actually doing research on this. So any of you budding researchers, you young and beautiful budding researchers, think about tackling and working on something which says the linkage between widowhood, withdrawal from school, and underage marriage, because this is a no-brainer. And I'm always absolutely scandalized that the UN, the Commission on the Status of Women, and our governments go on failing to understand how important the widowhood issues are, not just as a gender and human rights. I think it's the most neglected of all gender and human rights issues, but because it's also a development issue for the future, because it increases inequality and poverty, and it's that inequality which actually promotes future conflict. So it's a vital, vital issue if we ever want to have peace in the world and peace in our countries. And now I finish. Thank you. Goodbye.